On this segment, I want to talk about human growth and development and the unique identity of student athletes. I think it's very important that you understand how this identity is created, how it evolves, and the magnitude of the athletic identity. And so I want to begin by talking about just identity development for teenagers, for student athletes. And we know that it's a very unique time for junior high and high school student athletes, and even into college. The major task that we see, if you look at different developmental theories, centers around understanding who am I. And I think that it's very easy to see if you work in a school system or if you're a private practice clinician and you regularly see teenagers or people in their early 20s, you will often notice that it's not uncommon for them to do things or dress in ways that calls attention to themselves, trying to find out where their place is in this world, trying to understand their values, trying to understand what their future holds. And so there is a high degree of experimentation and visiting with different people, creating new friendships, new relationships, and so on. But how this all plays into the developmental stages that athletes experience is what I want to talk about here. And I think that James Marcia's work is very interesting and very applicable to understanding student athletes. And if you recall from any of your human growth and development psychology courses, or maybe even in an introduction to psychology, you probably remember Marcia's 4 stages of identity. There was identity diffusion, identity moratorium, identity achievement, and finally identity foreclosure. And it's that last one that I want to spend time talking about here today. Identity foreclosure is really, in essence, when a person stops finding out or learning about their unique identity and what they might be best equipped for their future with respect to their interests, their aptitude, their proficiencies. And you might think of it in a way where the youngster has already foregone any thought as to learning about him or her and their unique strengths and interests, and instead simply foreclosed or come to a very quick decision that this is what I'm going to do. So you might think of maybe a rural setting where it's a farming family, and for generations they've had a farm, and now here is a youngster who's 13, 14, 15 years old, and he already knows that he's going to take over that farm. And again, the point here is not to judge whether that's good, bad, right, or wrong, but what I'm trying to introduce is the concept that in identity foreclosure, there really isn't that exploration. It's just assumed that a person will take on that identity. Now, how does identity foreclosure tie into student athletes? And I want to talk about that here at this point. I first want to introduce how your general identity is developed, and then we'll come back to identity foreclosure. But when we talk about general identity for all of us, we typically look at it in one of two, angles. One would be your self-identity, and that's quite simply how you would identify yourself to others. So if we were to meet and shake hands and I said, "Tell me about yourself," what would you say? What would you have to say in those first 10, 20 seconds? You might identify yourself as a counselor, maybe you're on the PTA, maybe you're the coach of your kid's Little League team. But those things that you offer up very early, that provides a nice litmus test to how you identify yourself. The second part is what we call your social identity, and that is how others view you. And that may or may not match up to how you identified yourself. And so for athletes, what's really interesting is that they often identify themselves as athlete. And so if you were to talk to a student athlete, maybe in your school system, he or she might quickly say, "Yeah, I play on the lacrosse team, I play on the football team," and so on. But then their social identity also is viewed as student athlete. And so that really compounds things, and when you bring both of them together, a self-identity and a social identity, how others view the person, that's when we start to see what we call an athletic identity emerge. And think about how that develops over time. If you go back to the last segment, we talked about how serious sports have been for kids for a number of years now. And what we see is kids today beginning to play competitive sports at a very early age, 4, 5, 6 years old. Again, many specialize, many play year-round. And so it really shouldn't surprise anyone that they themselves begin to see themselves as athletes. They develop that athletic identity. And so as that athletic identity increases, what they overlook is the fact that they're often talented in other parts of their life and have abilities beyond sports. But unfortunately, that sometimes isn't acknowledged. And so they see themselves as an athlete, and then everyone around them often begins to identify with them as also being an athlete. And a lot of times this happens in very innocuous ways. For example, when I do these lectures for teachers, I sometimes ask the question, how many times have you been guilty where a kid comes into class and the first question you ask is, how'd you guys do in that game last night? Or how many points did you score? That's an innocent question. You certainly don't have anything negative involved in that question. But think about, for the kid, day after day, week after week, year after year, you have people in your world who don't really ask about how you're doing in math class, or what's going on in your neighborhood or your home, any of those questions, but instead the questions are always around sports. And so, it's pretty easy to understand how the social identity becomes athlete. And again, why am I spending so much time talking about this? Well, because we know through empirical research findings that the stronger and more exclusive that athletic identity becomes, the more that it's inversely related to other very important life experiences. So for example, we know that the stronger and more exclusive athletic identity is, the less likely that person will have a high level of what we call career maturity. I'll come back to that in a moment. We also know that the stronger the athletic identity is, the less likely that person is going to have a high level of self-efficacy or confidence in his or her abilities outside of sports. We also know that, again, the stronger the athletic identity is, the less likely that person is going to have really solid, responsible future plans outside of sports. So we know that a lot of these things go on. Let's go back to career maturity for just a moment. Career maturity is generally defined as your readiness to make age-appropriate career decisions or choices. And so if you were to ask a 6-year-old, for example, what he or she wants to be when they grow up, you might expect the answers to be all over the place. To be an astronaut, a rocket scientist, to be the president. Of course, we want every kid to have dreams and aspirations, and that's great. But odds are those are really considered to be long-shot occupations. In fact, even if they were not considered long-shot occupations, the youngster may come to find out at 16 or 26 years old that they have no interest in those career paths. But at 6 years old, it's probably what they've seen on TV or maybe something that mom or dad have talked about at home and it sounds good. So the level of career maturity is very low, and we would expect that from a 6-year-old. Now, as you might imagine, as we go up the ladder chronologically, ideally people become more crystallized in what their future career path might entail. And that is largely because they understand who they are, what their talents, interests, aptitudes are, but they also become more exposed to realistic careers out there, some of the things that maybe they never even knew existed. And so this all levels out. But for athletes, and especially athletes who have a very strong athletic identity, they simply haven't taken the time to explore what it is that they're interested in doing, what they're able to do, what they might really have a true talent toward. Because to this point in their life, all they've thought of is athletics. And so, that would be, again, a really big reason why we want to understand the athletes who show the strongest athletic identity and how we might approach. And so let me continue on with this because it's very important. You might look for warning signs. Again, let's say that you are a school counselor. You know certain kids in the school that's all they wear every day is athletic gear. The hats, the shirts, the letterman's coats. If you were to go home in their room, you'd look at poster after poster of athletes. It's not that difficult to see the ones that have the strongest grasp on being an athlete. Now, that in and of itself is not a bad thing necessarily, so I'm not suggesting that you go out today and talk to that kid's parents and say, wow, you got to pull this kid back. But what I am saying is that is generally a more high-risk person to have difficulties when sport retirement occurs. And one thing that we know for sure, just like death and taxes, sport retirement is inevitable. Every person who competes in athletics will eventually have to retire, some sooner than others. But we do know that be it an injury or deselection, being cut from a team, or just voluntarily quitting. I mean, there's a lot of different reasons why athletes leave sports, but we do know eventually they will. And so that's why we keep coming back to your more high-risk student athletes who are going to be in greater need of a therapeutic intervention, some counseling support, will most likely be the ones who have the strongest and most exclusive athletic identity. And so you want to keep an eye out. And if you're really having trouble seeing the visual signs, maybe it's a student athlete who doesn't adorn him or herself in the athletic gear, you can simply begin with some open-ended questions. If you happen to get a referral or you're talking to a kid on your own that you see is distressed, you might just open up by asking an open-ended question. Tell me some things about yourself. And if that response is contained within the world of athletics, again, that might be a pretty clear sign that the person really doesn't see much value or worth beyond sports. So that, again, is a really key component here to working with student athletes. So going back to just kind of recap a few things, the student athletes who have that foreclosed identity, where they really have only thought about being a college or pro athlete, the ones who have a self and social identity completely wrapped around being an athlete, we would call that a strong athletic identity. Those are the ones that you really want to pay attention to, certainly not at the expense of looking at all student athletes and what any student athlete might need, but you know that your high-risk people are going to be in that group. I also want to just quickly recap what I mentioned in the first segment about that stigma. Again, if you're working in a school system, it is very unlikely that the student athletes in your school system are going to go knock on your door and talk about things that they find to be troubling for them. Now, that might be true for teenagers in general, but I can tell you from working with student athletes for so many years, this is especially true for them. It's again the way that they're raised. You don't cry, you dust yourself off. You get beat up or cut or injured, you get it taken care of. So there is kind of that toughness that comes with sports. Talking to counselors, psychologists, other helping professionals, for a lot of them it is considered or looked at as a sign of weakness. So again, I just want to remind you of that you may need to really go above and beyond and find creative ways to working with others in your school system, or if you're a community counselor, finding ways to get your name out there in non-threatening ways to kind of normalize the process, that not every student athlete who seeks your help is dealing with psychopathology or even something that you could necessarily diagnose with the DSM. It could just be some of their lifestyle issues. For example, talking about this identity. I look at this as a very educational approach. If you're a counselor, you may even want to set up a workshop or some kind of training intervention where parents, coaches can come to and help them understand how to identify those athletic transferable skills, to parlay those skills into other areas, which in turn really broadens an identity. If you've got a student athlete, for example, who's got all the confidence in the world in his or her sport, can go and shoot free throws with 1 second left in the game and a hostile crowd behind the hoop, trying to throw the kid off his or her shot, if they can succeed there, but yet they're having trouble getting up in front of a classroom and giving a speech, or they have what they call test anxiety, it's quite likely that they already have the skill set to overcome the anxiety. They simply haven't parlayed that over into taking tests or giving speeches. And so, again, these are just a couple examples of ways that you can kind of broach that relationship with student athletes in ways that are not threatening and don't look as though the athlete is a loser or someone who has, psychopathology. I mean, let's face it, nobody wants to wear those labels. And in my experience, I have found that when you frame it as part of a normative process of providing, general counseling, educational approaches to working with athletes, when you're able to do that, I find that they more quickly let their guard down, and that allows you again to build that trust, that rapport, and to use the counseling skills that you have and that you know would be beneficial if you had the chance to work with a student athlete. And so, again, that's a little bit about human growth and development, how it applies to student athletes. A really, really big part of the foundation of working with athletes is understanding the identity, and I think the sooner that you learn about this and even call from your own experiences. Many of you watching this program today previously played sports, maybe at a high level, maybe not at a high level, maybe you just played junior high or high school sports, but even so, you can still acknowledge how quickly this identity can come about. And so hopefully some of these tips will help you reach out and more successfully work with student athletes in the future.